Hello friends and welcome. I am Samantha of Krebs Blockkeeper Crafts, and if you're new here, I show you how I make things. Subscribe for more. Today I'm sharing with y'all tips and tricks for making my newest pattern, Cobblestone Bridges. This pattern is a great way to use up scraps, remnants, and pre-cuts in all kinds of shapes and sizes. Yes, you heard me right. This pattern is all the pre-cuts friendly. Charm squares, layer cakes, and jelly roll. All of them work. To start with, let's talk about fabric selections. For this pattern, you will need two contrasting cuts of fabric, one for the background and one for the sashing, and you need some kind of feature fabric for the cobblestones. This can be anything from just one fabric to a bunch of different scraps in any kind of colorway or any pre-cut. The only important thing to remember is that the fabric you pick for the sashing needs to contrast with both the background and the fabric for your cobblestones. Other than that, anything goes. Today I am working with a rainbow for my cobblestones. This was a batik half jelly roll that I picked up on impulse that's kind of been sitting in my stash for about 7 years. To go with it, I'm using this soft gray for the sashing. It has a good contrast against all the colors, and for my background, I'm just going to go with simple Kona black. So I have all my pieces cut for the center of the block here. So I have the sashing that goes in between all of the feature bits. I have the sashing that goes in between the blocks, and then I have the sashing for the top and bottom of the center. So this is everything for this portion here. I'm going to show you guys some of the tips and tricks for making this specific part of the block because there are a lot of gotchas. So this specific block requires a perfect scant 1/4 inch seam. There's all this tiny 1-inch sashing, and if your seam is not the right size, when you sash these two pieces together and you go to sew this piece to the bottom, it's not going to match up if your seam allowance isn't accurate. So the very first thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that we're sewing a perfect seam allowance. So let's go ahead and show you guys how I test and make sure that I'm sewing the right seam allowance. So to make sure that we're sewing a perfect seam allowance, first we need to pick our frame of reference. So the frame of reference that I like to use is the edge of my presser foot here. What a lot of people use is they use a ledge of tape. If I were to use that ledge of tape, I'd have to replace it a lot. I need to access this compartment for my top load bobbin. So I just use the edge of my presser foot, the standard presser foot on my machine, lines up perfectly with the edge of my feed dog channel. And so I just use the edge of my presser foot and the edge of my feed dog channel to make sure that I have things lined up perfectly. So I can do that because I can shift my needle left and right. I have the ability on my particular machine to move my needle wherever I would like to position it to sew whatever kind of seam allowance that I want. So we're going to check to make sure that we're using a 1/4 inch seam. We're going to start by measuring. So what I'm going to do is since I'm using the edge of my presser foot, I'm going to go ahead and line up a 1/4 inch mark on my ruler with the edge of my feed dog channel, drop my presser feet, and line that up on my 1/4 inch line. Okay, so that is lined up. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to shift my needle over to the left until I'm about lined up with that. And then I'm going to lower my needle and double check that I am appropriately lined up. So where my needle is right now, let's shift it back one. Where my needle is right now is just on the edge of the ruler. So I'm going to move you guys in closer so that you can see. My needle is just barely touching the edge of my ruler. So now that I've got my needle positioned for my first test piece, which some of you who already know how to do this know that this is not going to quite work out right, but we're going to test this first. So this is what's called a true 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I have 2 small squares of fabric here. These are each 2 inches square. So let's go ahead and sew these together, and then we'll measure them after the fact. So I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, which means I'm going to lose a 1/4 inch off of each piece, which means this should come out to 3.5 inches wide all the way across. So I placed my piece on the sewing machine, lined up the edge of my fabric with the edge of my presser foot. I'm going to go run over my ironing board and I'm going to press this really quick and then I'll be back with my ruler. So I went ahead and pressed my piece. I pressed my seam to the side, just to the black side. They're both dark fabric, so it doesn't really matter which side you press it to. But let's go ahead and measure this and see what we got. So now you can see my 1 3/4 inch line is not actually on my seam. It's actually right next to it. You can see some of the blue is poking out there. And you can see over here, I am just shy of my 3.5 inch line here. You can see the table between the line and the side of my piece. So the reason why that is if we go ahead and we look at the seam, there's a fold in the seam. You can probably see it better on this side. So there's a fold. That fold is going to take up just a little bit of fabric, which means that I'm not going to get a perfect 1/4 inch seam. Well, it is a perfect 1/4 inch seam, but I'm not going to take out exactly a 1/4 inch of fabric from my pieces. I'm going to take out just a smidge more of a 1/4 inch of fabric from my pieces. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to move my needle over one more tick, and then we'll try this again and we'll measure again. All right, so I'm going to move my needle over one more tick. You saw it just slip over just the teeniest, tiniest bit. And if I go ahead and measure this again, my needle comes down solidly on the edge of my ruler. It's not like wishy-washy, like lined up with the perfect edge. It's actually solidly on the edge of my ruler. So I don't know if you guys can see that very well because it's clear plastic in there. But it is solidly over the edge of my ruler and is looking like it's piercing to the right of where the 1/4 inch line would be. That's exactly what we want. So when you measure, make sure you measure so that your needle is going to land to the right of your line. So I've got another 2 pieces of fabric here. Both of these again are 2 inches square. So we're aiming for exactly 3.5 inches when we sew these pieces together. So let's go ahead and line them up and then sew them together. Alrighty, now I'm going to pop over to my pressing board and I'm going to go ahead and press the seam to the side and then we'll come back and measure it. So I've gone ahead and pressed my piece flat and we'll go ahead and measure it again and see what we got. So you can see that my 1 3/4 inch line is directly on top of my seam and my 3.5 inch line is perfectly on top of the edge of my piece. So this is how we get an accurate scant 1/4 inch seam, which is absolutely necessary when you're sewing that block together because of all these tiny little sashing. The other trick for making sure that we get perfect seams and perfect sashing is, so I'm kind of guilty of this, and all y'all perfect seamstresses out there and sewers are not guilty of this, and so you can laugh at me. But I can get really lazy when I'm cutting my stuff, and I don't necessarily press out the folds in my fabric from storing. And so sometimes I'll get these really weird flippy-doos. So that's not going to fly when you're piecing something as precise as that. So don't be like me. In fact, I'm probably going to go over to my ironing board and I'm going to go ahead and press that flat so that I don't have that fold. But make sure your pieces are nice and flat. It also helps to use starch so that, because some of these pieces are cut on the cross grain, and so they may have a bit of stretch to them, and that can distort your pieces as well. So starch also helps if you are afraid of stretching out your pieces. So I'm going to go press some of these and then I'll show you how this block comes together. All right, so if you're using an organized layout like I am, the pattern recommends that you lay out your pieces in the format that you would want them to show up in the final block. So I've gone ahead and I've laid out my pieces like my final block layout. And it's going to tell you that you're going to pick up 2/3 of these pieces. So they're going to be A's and C's. You'll notice this center unit, it flips the A and the B. That's because honestly, that center unit is the exact same as the side units. Ta-da! Notice how they're all the exact same, except your colors are reversed. So I'm actually kind of lazy, and I like to pick up all my stuff and chain piece. So I will take all of my A's and stack them up. And then I will take all of my C's and stack them up. And I'm just going to go to my sewing machine and sew until I run out of these pieces. These are all individual unique colors.
Once I'm done sewing them and pressing them, I'm going to come back and I'm going to put them back in the layout. And I have my block up here. I already made a sample block. So I have my block up here as a reference of what color is going to go where. If you don't necessarily have a reference, you can either color something in, because there is a coloring page in the pattern. You can go ahead and color in one of those blocks and use that as your reference. Or you can take a picture. So once you have it laid out, you can go ahead and snap a picture, and that way you know what your layout looks like. Or sometimes I'll use little scrap pieces and I'll leave them on the table where they're supposed to be. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sash these on with my perfect scant 1/4 inch seam allowance that we just measured, and then I'll be back once I have these all sashed together and pressed. So the other really important thing about getting precise seams when you're assembling these blocks is pressing things accurately. So when you press things accurately, you're not going to stretch, you're not going to distort, you're not going to pull things so that your fabrics will distort in different directions. The way that you press things really well is first, you lay your piece completely down and you take a hot iron and you set the seam. Use steam or don't use steam to your heart's content. I prefer to use steam because I don't really get an option with my iron because this part don't work so well. So, my seam is nice and flat. For comparison, here's one where the seam has not been set. Do you see all of these warbles and everything up here at the top? You want to go ahead and set your seam so that it's nice and flat. So I'll usually put a couple of these on my ironing board, set the seams, and by the time I get my full ironing board done, then I come back to the first one, and it's cool enough for me to go ahead and fold this back very gently and finger press it a bit, just a little bit. And then go ahead and grab my iron and just press it over. I'm doing this one-handed. Normally I would have held that back, but I have to hold the microphone because I don't have a very nice microphone yet. Sorry about that. I know somebody complained about the microphone quality. I'm trying. Got to get the budget first. So there we go. That's how we get a nice, clean seam. So there's no pockets or anything in here. It's just nicely pressed back and it's nice and flat. So I'll show you that again with this one, and I will put the mic down and use both hands. So there we go. That's what that looks like when you use both hands. Much easier to do. So you're going to go ahead and do this for all the pieces that you've got your sashing sewn onto, and then we'll go back and lay them back out, and I'll show you guys the next step. Alright, everything is sewn and pressed, and I've got everything laid back out with my upside down middle piece. Remember, I rotated it so that everything is facing the same way, just because I'm lazy and I like to sew things all the same way and I not have to think about it. So this is upside down. So now I'm going to pick up all of these pieces and I'm going to sew these in pairs. So let's go ahead and make stack 1. And here's stack 2. And then we're going to head over to this machine and we are going to sew those together. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to sew these to the bottoms. So we're just going to stack these up and stack these up and go sew them together. Okay, so just a quick little reminder. If you've sewn these two pieces together with your perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance, this should line up pretty perfectly on the back. And then when you go to sew this piece onto the bottom, it should be the exact size that it needs to be. So no trimming of these pieces should be required if you are sewing with an accurate scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. So make sure, this is why it's really important, test and make sure that you are sewing with a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance before you start this project. That way everything lines up perfectly. have 3 sets of T units completely done and pressed. So remember, we assembled this one upside down because that way we could just treat them all as the same type of unit. So we're going to turn that one. The next step is to take this sashing. Now remember, all of the proper sizes and everything are in the pattern, which is in the link in the description below. So we're going to sew the sashing in between our T units. We're going to go ahead and assemble these into a row to make the very center of the block. All right, the very center of the block is together.
So it probably would help if I explain how I put these together. So to sash these together, first I sewed this piece onto this piece. Then I sewed this piece onto this piece, and this piece onto this piece, and then I came all the way back over here and sewed this piece onto the other side of this piece. And then once I got everything pressed, I sewed these 2 sets of units together, and then I sewed this set of units onto the end.
The last thing to do before we sew on the sides is that we need to sash the narrow sashing to either side of the center piece. And that's it. There's the center of my blocks complete. So I'm going to go ahead and finish these blocks out to the pattern instructions, and then I will come back for final assembly. I have one more tip to show you guys before this quilt is completely finished. So this block is designed so that you don't actually really have to match any seams. These seams that are across this piece of sashing don't match up at all. And while you might line these up, if they're not perfectly aligned across this, you're not going to notice because your eye is just going to line those up magically. You don't have to worry about matching seams except the seams between the blocks when you assemble the blocks into the final quilt. So I personally find it easiest to assemble quilts when I can nest the seams between the blocks as I'm sewing my rows together. If you always press the seam to one specific orientation of block, then your seams are always going to be pressed in opposite directions. So for example, we'll take just this particular block right here. So if I decide that I'm always going to press to blocks with vertical centers, my seam here is going to be pressed this way, and my seam over on this side is going to be pressed that way. And then above it, I'm going to have a block that's in the horizontal orientation, and its seams are going to be pressed away from it. So this seam is pressed that way, and then this seam will be pressed that way. I have no idea if you can see that because the camera's way up high and I don't have a viewfinder. So sorry if some of my hand signals are terrible. I recommend pressing to the vertical blocks because there are no seams that are perpendicular to this vertical seam on this block. So this seam is going to lay nice and flat. You're not bending over any of these seams here that are intersecting with this vertical seam. So you get a nice flat seam, and then your seams will always nest. And so what is seam nesting? This is one of the first things that I learned when I learned how to quilt, but not everybody knows what seam nesting is. So seam nesting, so remember when we were talking about the 1/4 inch, the perfect 1/4 inch? Remember when I was talking about that lip of fabric? So that lip sits up a little bit. And if you have lips that go in opposite direction, those little ledges that go in opposite directions, you can butt those ledges up against each other and your seams will sit very nicely together. I'm sorry, this is black fabric, and so you guys aren't going to be able to see it very well. So let's grab you guys a little bit closer and I'll show you on some of my sample squares. So remember my 2 little sample pieces from earlier. So you can see it a little bit better here. You can see there's a little lip that my nail is catching on from when we press the seam to the side. So there is actually a little lip right there. So if I take these, both of these were pressed to the black, and I put them together so that the seams are going in opposite directions. So this seam is going this way. On this side, this seam is going that way. If I go ahead and butt those ledges up against each other, my seams are locked into place. So you can see, maybe it'll focus, so you can see my seams are nice and locked into place. So 2 ledges, just butt them up against each other. And then when you go ahead and sew, you don't have to worry about matching that. So let me go ahead and sew this together and I'll show you what I mean. So I've gone ahead and sewed these together where those seams were nested together. And now if I open this up, I'm going to end up with perfectly matched corners.
And this is what those corners look like when the seams nest just right. So remember, press in opposite directions and nestle the lips of the seams up against each other. And that's that. That is every trick up my sleeve for precisely piecing this quilt. If you want to make your own version of this quilt, the link to the pattern is in the description below. And if you do make one, I love it when y'all share it with me on social media. You can find me on Instagram at Crafts, and thank you for sticking around. If you want to see more tutorials like this, check out my channel. I don't know when I'll get around to posting the next one, but you can stay in the know by subscribing. That's it for now. I'll catch you later.